My daughter and I had just dropped my wife off at the airport to go visit her parents for the next 2 weeks, and by the time we were driving home, the sun had already gone down and the moon was covered by a shroud of clouds. The only source of light on the road was the headlights of every passing car. The two of us were excited to get home. I promised my daughter that we would order a pizza and watch a bunch of her favorite Barbie movies all night. As we got closer to home, I pulled off the highway and we began driving along the back roads for the last 20 or so minutes of the drive. I'm not sure what it was, but as soon as we began driving down the less populated road, I began to feel really tense. I did my best not to worry my daughter though, and just began singing along to the radio like we usually do. Like always, I sort of fell into a trance, and because I have driven this route a million times, I just sort of zoned out as we were driving along. I was snapped out of it though. When I saw my daughter point out of her peripheral vision, she asked me what that was as she pointed toward the side of the road ahead of us. That was when I saw what appeared to be a young woman kneeling down, practically sitting on the side of the road. Instinctually, I began to slow down, but to my surprise, my daughter almost went into a panic as we began to approach the woman. She turned to me and practically begged me not to stop. And before I could even ask her why not, I noticed that she began tearing up. So of course, I listened to her and continued past the person. As we kept going, I tried to calm my daughter down, but the fact that I didn't stop to make sure she was okay continued to eat at me. I asked my daughter why she didn't want me to slow down, and she said that woman scared her. I thought that her imagination must have just been running wild, so I began to explain to her that that woman might have needed help and that we should have really go back and check on her, but I didn't want to make my daughter uncomfortable. Thankfully, her mother always taught her to treat others with kindness, and once she understood, she basically insisted that we go back and help. Sure enough, as soon as we hit a wide enough stretch of road, I turned around and began driving back to the spot where we saw the woman sitting on the ground. The thing that surprised us was as we approached, we saw that she was no longer sitting along the road and was now standing and making her way toward the direction that we were coming from. As we got closer, I could see that there was clearly blood on the woman's face. It wasn't clear where the injury was though. It sort of looked like it had been splattered across her face instead of coming from her own wound. I began to slow down, and as soon as my car came to a stop across the road from her, my daughter started panicking again. I looked at her, and as she looked back up toward me, I'll never forget the look of terror on her face. She let out a loud scream, and as I looked back out of the window, the woman who we had been looking for was now rushing toward my car. As she approached the window, she began slamming on it with her fist and screaming at the top of her lungs. My daughter was now in hysterics, and all I could think to do was pull away as fast as I could. Once we were far enough away for me to pull over, I did and immediately notified the police about what we had just seen. There was a woman who wasn't in the right state of mind, wandering along the side of the road covered in what may or may not have been her own blood. The police took me very seriously, thankfully, but by the time they came to us, they claimed that they couldn't find anyone matching the description we gave them. I don't think I've ever seen my daughter so scared in her life than when the woman came up and started slamming on our window. After a long weekend at my sister's wedding, I was happy to be heading home. It was an 8-hour drive through 3 states, but since I left my cousin's house, where I had stayed for the weekend, at around 2 in the afternoon, I figured I'd be home by midnight at the latest. Most of the drive had been pleasant. It was pretty straightforward after getting onto the highway, but around 9:30 p.m., I couldn't press on anymore. I had become too hungry, and at the point so I pulled to the side of the road and began checking my phone for the closest McDonald's or Wendy's that was open at the time. The highway was relatively empty, but the sound of every passing car was still enough to almost make me jump. I know it had been my decision to pull onto the side of the highway, but that was always a move that made me uneasy. To make matters worse, My phone was only getting a single bar of cell reception, and the maps function was having a hard time searching for a local restaurant. I did my best to stay calm as multiple big rig trucks passed by, giving off a gust of wind that was enough to shake my car a bit. And by that point, my phone had finally loaded up a page of restaurants. I selected the closest McDonald's as my destination and got ready to pull back onto the highway. However, as soon as I hit my blinker, I noticed that a car that was coming up from behind me began to slow down and pull off to the side of the road. As the car began to approach mine, I just figured that someone thought I might need help and was coming to offer a helping hand. It wasn't until I saw the blue and red lights turn on that I realized it was a police officer. I immediately rolled down my window, turned my car off, and removed the keys from the ignition. And it wasn't long before I could see someone walking toward the driver's side of my car. It struck me as odd that the officer wasn't wearing a uniform of any sort, but I figured he might have been undercover or something of the sort. As he approached my window, I began to talk very respectfully, asking the officer how his night was going. Right away, he asked me if I knew why he pulled me over, which was confusing because I had already been stopped, but I didn't want to push the officer's button, so I simply said no, sir. He then went on to explain that he caught me speeding a couple miles back, which didn't make any sense because I had been stopped on the side of the road for the past 10 minutes or so. When I tried to explain that to him, he said that he didn't want to argue and then asked me for my license and registration. Right away, I had felt uneasy about this interaction, but in my head, there was nothing that I could do about it. I reached into my glove box and pulled out all the documentation and presented it to the officer. "Sit tight, I'll be right back," he said to me as he walked back toward his car to check my information. I figured that this might take a little while, but to my surprise, he was in his car for less than a minute before rushing toward the driver's side of my car. He grabbed the door handle and pulled it open quickly as he ordered me to step out of the car. Right away, I noticed that his hand was now placed on his hip as he was holding onto his gun. I complied and began to step out of my car, but as I did, I asked him what the problem was. That was when he notified me that I apparently had a warrant out for my arrest in some county in Arkansas. Now, that also didn't make sense because I had never visited Arkansas before. I tried to explain that this must have been some sort of mistake, and I asked to speak to his superior so maybe we can figure out what went wrong. He didn't like that I questioned him, and the man immediately grabbed my wrist and threw me up against the side of my car. What happened next was a bit surprising. Instead of the feeling of cold metal cuffs touching my wrist, it felt as though he was using some sort of flimsy plastic. And sure enough, I heard the sound of the zip tie tightening around my two wrists. That was when I knew something was really wrong. I looked back over my shoulder at the man who was now standing there with a sinister smile on his face. "You're not a police officer, are you?" The smile fell from the man's face, but he didn't utter a word as he began to pull me off of my car. He tried to get me to walk back toward his vehicle, but something just seemed off, and I felt the need to resist. I began to pull myself away from the man, but he responded by placing his hand on his hip once again. Only this time, he verbally threatened to shoot me. Right then, I gave up the fight and began to turn toward the man's car. That was when a miracle happened. As we were walking, another set of flashing lights began to come down the highway and pulled up behind the unmarked car that belonged to the arresting officer. This time, a fully uniformed police officer stepped out what was clearly a police car, and he began making his way toward me and the other man. He must have seen that I had felt uneasy because right away he began questioning the man who had placed me under arrest. The man insisted that he was an undercover officer for the county, but he clearly got anxious as the uniformed officer began to press him for more information, including a badge number. It quickly became clear to everyone that the man who had placed me in zip-tie handcuffs was not a police officer. And that was when the situation changed entirely. The uniformed officer drew his weapon and demanded that the other man step away from me, and to my surprise, he listened. Within seconds, the other man was placed on the floor and having real handcuffs placed on his wrists. I was taken to the police station to give my statement as well as my information, and after they had spoken to the man, The police let me know that he admitted to doing this across 7 states in the past 2 years. They couldn't tell if he was telling the truth or not, but the man himself claimed to have killed 14 victims, and I was apparently supposed to be number 15. After a long day at work, all that was on my mind was getting home. I worked in Manhattan and lived about an hour out of the city, so I had a long drive ahead of me, but I figured I'd throw on a podcast and I'd be home in no time. I never could have expected what would happen as I approached a streetlight shortly after crossing the bridge out of the city. I began pulling up to the light as it turned from green to yellow, then to red. I slowed my car down to a halt and waited patiently. There was no other car around, but to my surprise, it looked like the intersection was popular. There was a group of 4 people that had been seemingly waiting to cross the street. As I came to a stop, I was confused that only one of them began to move forward through the crosswalk, but I figured it was no big deal. At least, that was until the man stopped right in front of my car and turned to look directly at me. It was like my headlight shining in his face didn't even faze him. The man stood in front of my car and lifted his hand to point, but I couldn't tell if he was pointing at me or behind me. I began to look to my left and to my right out of confusion, and that was when I noticed that one of the men that were in the group on the sidewalk had begun walking toward the passenger side of my car. My first reaction was to put my car in reverse so that I could back away from the situation. But just as I went to do that, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw another one of the men had now positioned himself directly behind my car. I began to panic. I didn't know what to do, and now the man who had been walking up to the side of my car was at the door. I could hear him trying to pull the door open, but the handle, thankfully, I had been smart enough to lock it. I tried honking the horn to move the man in front of the car out of the way, but he wouldn't budge. That was when I noticed another man start to cross the street, and as he crossed across my car, I knew that it was heading toward my driver's side door. The only thing I could think to do was to put my car into drive and slowly move forward, hoping that it would force the men to move out of the way. The man in the front of the car tried to put his hands on the hood to stop me, but at that point, I was committed and pushed a little bit harder on the gas pedal as I steered a bit to the side. As the 2 men in the front of my car got pushed out of the way, I pressed down on the pedal harder and eventually managed to speed out of there. As I got farther away, I called the police to report the incident, but after that, I heard absolutely nothing about it.